One of the things that makes being a sports fan fun is to debate greatest ever, worst ever, overrated, underrated, your favorite players, the players you hated the most. And to me, that's part of the fun of being a fan, which is short for fanatic, right? And one of the things that naturally ties into that fandom is when we start talking about halls of fame, because that's a way to stay in touch with the history of a sport, game, team that we absolutely love and live for, right? It's a way to pay homage to the past. It is a way to remember the times gone by, the great players of the past, all of that. It's a chance for you to see those players that you grew up watching or watched over the years be validated for their greatness. Certainly, incredible honor for all of those players that in their respective sports get selected for the Hall of Fame. Now, I'm here specifically to talk about the Pro Football Hall of Fame in Canton, Ohio, and more specifically, the voting process that goes each year with the selections that lead to the choices for the Hall of Fame. And one of the things that's striking to me is, how few people are really familiar with the Hall of Fame process. And, it is something with some of my friends and the things that I do with the Not in Hall of Fame committee. Some of the work there I've learned from like Paul Lawrence and Jack Silverstein and others in terms of Ron Caphill, former NFL Fan of the Year for the Broncos. He's the guy who used to wear the Gradishar jersey all the time. I've learned a lot about the Hall of Fame. It makes me understand and appreciate just how little many others understand. Like when somebody posts something about one of the 25 guys being named as modern era semifinalist, and somebody will be talking about Roger Craig or Ken Anderson, and it doesn't matter because they're part of the senior pool now. They've surpassed their modern eligibility, which now runs 20 years. There's a 5-year waiting period, and then you've got 20 years on the modern ballot before you fall into the abyss that is known as the senior pool, and how many fans don't really know that. And another thing I see a lot of is people talking about and acknowledging, and even the voters sometimes acknowledging, that they have a tough job, and frankly, sometimes it's kind of thankless. And there's certainly an element of that that's true. You can't please everyone. Somebody's always going to be mad. Somebody's always going to disagree. That's just the nature of the beast, right? And there's no doubt that it can be really hard to compare players across different positions, across different teams, spanning potentially different eras of the game, and make decisions that ultimately impact legacies. Like, it is not a small thing to say that Hall of Fame label matters to some of these former players. It can positively impact their future drawing power at appearances and card shows and etc. So this stuff matters. And I know the voters take that seriously. However, perhaps it wouldn't be so bad for them sometimes, it wouldn't be so thankless if they didn't make it so hard on themselves. Because transparently over the years, and especially in the past few years, the more I've learned about the process for the Pro Football Hall of Fame, the more I've learned about the voters and their trends and patterns and their behaviors and decisions, I don't respect them more. I respect them a little less. I hold them in lower esteem than I did before. Because the bottom line is, the Pro Football Hall of Fame voters just need to do better. And I've got some suggestions to throw out here in terms of what that might look like. Number one, more formal discussions are necessary, vital, and in this modern era, not very hard to do. I don't want to hear they've all got jobs because they're writers for teams or they do this. BS. BS. It ain't that hard. It isn't. They only have one truly formal discussion each year, and that's when you get to the finalists, the round of 15. And the problem with that is not all players' cases can be entirely served their full justice based just on stats or memories of people, memories of media members. A very flawed way to do it, right? Sometimes conversation and context matters. I've seen that in some conversations I've had over the past year or two as I've tried to elevate the profile of guys like Albert Lewis and Tim McDonald, and have seen as I talk about these guys and other people talk about these guys, how the profile starts to raise in the eyes of others and they start to think about guys differently. I've seen it happen to me in terms of thinking about players a little differently, positively or negatively, after hearing context from others. And no matter how many behind the scenes chats these guys may have with, and gals may have with each other, the 50 of them, it's not the same as getting together in formal sessions. And in the modern age, when you could dial up on Zoom or Microsoft Teams or whatever the hell you want to use, there is no excuse that sometime during the week, during the NFL season, they can't get together one or two more times to discuss the candidates that have gotten to a certain point, to discuss anything that they want to solve for as a committee before just leaving it all up to the round of 15, the finalist round. They can do this. I've seen some voters, when pressed by myself and others on it, push back on this, and I'm sorry, if it offends, I don't care. Like, it's kind of lazy. Do a little better. This is a very important honor that these 50 voters have. They should treat it like it. Oh, they're not getting paid. I'm not getting paid to talk about this, but I can still talk about it. Like, it's not that hard. I'm not asking to commit entire days and weeks to this crap, right? But one or two more formal discussions in October and November to make sure that they solve for the things they want to, make sure that some of these players that are slipping through the cracks over the years are getting their just due and getting their chance. I think that's a very small price and yet important price to pay. Another thing the voters could do better with and need to do better with is avoiding self-induced positional backlogs. Like, don't be complaining about the backlogs at certain positions that you as a voter pool have created yourself. These voters undervalued the safety position for years, took too long to get some of them in, such as a Steve Atwater, such as a Leroy Butler, such as somebody who's still not in, a Darren Woodson, let alone before I even get to a Tim McDonald. But they made sure they got John Lynch in relatively quickly. I wonder why. Give me a break, right? That's a problem of their own doing. Like, Brian Dawkins wasn't a first ballot Hall of Famer. Some people may not know this, because there was legitimately a debate among the voters on whether Brian Dawkins or John Lynch was better. I mean, even if you think John Lynch was a Hall of Famer, I don't really think he meets the standard, but even if you think he was, if you can't clearly understand the difference between a Brian Dawkins and a John Lynch, that's a problem. And that is a problem the voters create for themselves. They devalue the position and they start putting in the wrong guys in the wrong orders, and it creates a damn backlog. Additionally, you don't need 6 wide receivers in the semifinal round of 25. They had 7 last year. Henry Ellard's not there this time only because he dropped off into the abyss of the senior pool. 6 wide receivers. That's more than a quarter of the semifinalists at one position. You don't need that many semifinalists at one position. The running back somehow went from 2 semifinalists in 2023, with neither one of them making the round of 15, to 4 with the addition of Eddie George and Tiki Barber this time. The voters aren't working through a backlog, they're creating one. And on that note, speaking of the wide receiver position, the voters have got to do better with reevaluating the bar for the wide receiver position. Not every wide receiver that had 6 or 7 1,000-yard seasons in their career is a Hall of Famer and needs to be up for consideration for the Hall of Fame. The game has changed a lot in the past 20-plus years, and their process just has not caught up. My friend and colleague, Jack Silverstein, has done a lot of work in terms of identifying trends and patterns with the Hall of Fame, and I give him full credit for this one, talking about when you look at players in the past, I think it's like 2 decades plus, every player that reaches the semifinals in the first 5 years, except for one, Steve Tasker, has ended up getting inducted some point in time during their modern eligibility. Therefore, based on that precedent, Hines Ward, who has been a semifinalist for some reason every year of eligibility, and Anquan Boldin, who's been a multi-time semifinalist now, are going to be inducted into Canton someday. That's just insane. It's not the Hall of Very Good, it's the Hall of Fame. It should be reserved for the best of the best. And to have Hines Ward and Anquan Boldin basically be on somewhat of a fast track for the Hall of Fame is silly and entirely the fault of the voters. They're not putting enough stringency on the Hall of Fame standards for the wide receiver position. They're not reevaluating based off of the modern game. and that's insane. And part of the problem is now you got 6 wide receivers in the top 25, no quarterbacks, 1 guard, no centers, 1 defensive tackle, 1 corner. Not enough positional spread, and that's a problem. Another big thing to me is I look at these results the past few years, and I see a lot of instances where it feels like the voters are just voting based off of and because of media and familiarity bias. No way in hell Dwight Freeney should have been a first ballot finalist. Probably shouldn't even have been a first ballot semifinalist. Yet he was. Robert Mathis is now a multi-time semifinalist in his first couple of years. Based off of that trend, not only do we expect Dwight Freeney to get into the Hall of Fame in the next few years, Robert Mathis eventually will. How silly is that, in my opinion, that these 2 Colts defenders who weren't even the most important Colts defenders on the 2006 championship team, that was easily Bob Sanders, because when Bob Sanders was out, the Colts defense with Freeney and Mathis was historically terrible against the run. It was Bob Sanders that made that defense go. It was Bob Sanders that made that defense better. But because of the Peyton Manning effect, these 2 defenders are advancing so far in the process because of the quarterback that they played with. Not even the defenses that they played on, the quarterback that they played with, because of how many primetime marquee games they played in. These voters have got to have higher, better standards than this. They've got to be able to see through this shit. James Harrison, really high peak, borderline guy to me. Didn't even have 100 career sacks. Really had 5 kind of peak years. But he has that interception return for a touchdown in the Super Bowl. It's a big moment. He doesn't need to be a multi-time semifinalist already. James Harrison is going to get in the Hall of Fame. Frankly, when I look at this, it feels more like a popularity contest in terms of actually judging the merits of these players. And if we're going to have this, we might as well have the fans do the vote at this point, because I look at some of these recent results and the voting patterns and trends, and I say the fans could do this. If the voters are going to vote like fanboys, then just have the fanboys vote. Why even have voters at this moment? Voters are supposed to know better. They're supposed to serve as stewards and protectors of the Hall of Fame and of the process and making sure the right guys get in and the wrong guys don't. And they're kind of falling asleep at the wheel in that responsibility, in my opinion. Which brings me to my next point. These voters at some point really need to put a greater focus on these late ballot eligibility guys. You've seen this happen a few times recently where late in the ballot, late in their eligibility, they're trying to get guys in the room, like Joe Jacoby was a multi-time finalist, but they didn't get him in. Everson Walls got to be like a 20th year Modern finalist, doesn't get in, still sitting in the senior pool. Same thing with Clay Matthews, but Sam Mills does get in year 20. Albert Lewis last year, it took him until his 20th and final year of Modern eligibility to become a finalist, and he almost got in. But part of the reason he didn't is, one, because the voters were too damn stubborn. They just had to put Rondé Barber in last year, which was stupid. I don't care how good Ira Kaufman's presentation was of him. I don't care how worthy the other voters thought he was. Albert Lewis was there in year 20. He couldn't wait, because if he doesn't get in now, who knows if or when he'll ever get in the senior pool. Meanwhile, Rondé Barber waits one more year. It's not a big deal. You could come right back in 2024 and elect him. But the voters were just too damn stubborn to get out of their own way, and they didn't let it happen. And now Albert Lewis is sitting on the outside looking in. Who knows when he gets in? But of course, Rondé Barber got in. If Albert Lewis had gotten into the room a couple of years before that, though, he'd be in by now. Tim McDonald, somebody I'm really big on for the Hall of Fame, was a year 20 guy that didn't even make the semifinalist group this year. What an outrage. He now falls into the senior safety abyss along with guys like Deron Cherry, Joey Browner, Nolan Cromwell. I'm sure in a couple of years he's going to be joined by one of the most underrated safeties and players of my lifetime, Eugene Robinson. And here's the thing. A lot of people are like, Tim McDonald, who? Bottom line is, statistically, he was superior to Darren Woodson. Not even close. He was statistically superior to Rodney Harrison. Two guys, by the way, that still had some eligibility left and are semifinalists, even though McDonald cleans their clock from a statistical comparison standpoint. Not to mention how he stacks up statistically incredibly favorably. It basically almost takes John Lynch's in some ways to make one Tim McDonald. Steve Atwater, similar type of thing. Leroy Butler is close, but Leroy Butler shouldn't have waited so long to get in the Hall of Fame, and neither should Tim McDonald. But instead now, In part, I think because the voters don't have more official conversations, Tim McDonald goes to the senior pool where he may never get in, and he absolutely should. And if anybody says, well, he wasn't better than John Lynch or Steve Atwater or Darren Woodson, you know what you're telling me? You're telling me that you are paying attention to media hype and bullshit. You didn't actually watch their guys in their career, because the people that actually study these guys, the people that have actually watched these guys, will come away pretty unanimous that Tim McDonald was better than Atwater, better than Lynch, on a similar par with Leroy Butler, a shade ahead of Darren Woodson, a shade ahead more of Rodney Harrison. But these voters didn't get that. Same thing with Leslie O'Neal. He's another year 20 guy that didn't make the semifinalists. Yet he has more 10-plus sack seasons and more career sacks than a Dwight Freeney, and was by far a more complete player, whereas Dwight Freeney was an absolute bum against the fucking run and got his shit pushed in the Super Bowl against John Tate of all damn people. I mean, he Mormoned his ass all day. He shut him down. Leslie O'Neal was a monster, and he was a complete player. He could play the run. He was good in coverage. He was great coming off the edge. He was a Pro Bowler both as a 3-4 outside linebacker, as a 4-3 defensive end. And if you want to say, well, I still think Freeney was better, okay, whatever. You're wrong, but whatever. Dwight Freeney shouldn't have been a first ballot finalist, and then in year 20, Leslie O'Neal can't even make the semifinals, because Leslie O'Neal played in Junior Seau's shadow and was saddled with quarterbacks during his career like Stan freaking Humphries in San Diego. Again, the voters have got to prioritize some of these late ballot eligibility guys, and they've got to look back past some of that media bias crap. Cornelius Bennett was a year 19 guy. He's got one more year. He has no shot right now, even though he was a more complete player than Robert Mathis and did it longer than a James Harrison. He played on 5 Super Bowl teams in the 90s, and he was a predominant player on those teams. He was a 2-time UPI Conference Defensive Player of the Year, which puts him in a similar light to guys like Jack Lambert and Mike Singletary and Charles Haley. Like, think about that. That's the type of level that he's on. Singletary and Lambert were first ballot Hall of Famers. Haley took a few years, but he's in. Biscuit is not. That's dumb. Robert Mathis being a multi-time semifinalist right out of the gate, and Cornelius Bennett can't get any traction in year 19 is ridiculous. And then that's not even to mention other late ballot guys like Richmond Webb and Lomas Brown, Ricky Waters. Like, he's not in because of for who, for what, and it ignores the great career that he had. Like, it's just ridiculous at this point. You know, Eric Allen, he's the only corner on the ballot this year, so maybe he gets into the round of 15, but the clock is ticking for him. Steve Wisniewski, like, there's these guys that are late ballot, but instead of prioritizing these late ballot guys, you're seeing guys like London Fletcher as semifinalists, and James Harrison immediately semifinalist, Anquan Bolden, Hines Ward is semifinalist every year. Like, they've got to get better at this, period. No pussyfooting around this. And then when it comes to the quarterback position, it's not such an impact now, although it does matter a little bit to me. They've got some things coming up in upcoming years with the quarterback position. The bottom line is this process has got to get better. And again, I give my credit to my friend and colleague, yes, Jack, I'm calling you a colleague, Jack Silverstein, who pointed out that when it comes to modern era quarterbacks, going back like the past 30 years or so, every modern era quarterback that has gotten into Canton has gotten in on the first ballot except for one. And that was Kurt Warner, and it only took him until the third ballot. So the Hall of Fame isn't differentiating between a Peyton Manning, a Dan Marino, a John Elway, a Brett Favre, and like a Troy Aikman and a Jim Kelly, for Christ's sakes. They're saying they're all first ballot guys. They've got to do better here. Because what it creates is an environment, kind of a self-defeating, self-fulfilling thing where you're either a first ballot guy as a quarterback or you don't get in at all, which leaves somebody like a Randall Cunningham, a late eligibility guy who won multiple major MVP awards at the most important position of the game, who you still feel the impact of what he did as the ultimate weapon of the game in the 90s. In the NFL today, you know, the late eligibility can't get on the ballot in part because you just got, again, have to have 6 freaking wide receivers. But part of that stigma of, well, he only had a few great years. Compare that to some other quarterbacks. He holds up a lot better than you think. Statistically holds up incredibly well against guys like Aikman and Jim Kelly, especially when you consider the lack of Pro Bowl All-Pro teammates on offense that Cunningham had around him compared to Aikman and Kelly. Donovan McNabb should be in the semifinal pool over an Eddie George or a Tiki Barber. Like, Donovan McNabb went to 5 conference championship games, 6-time Pro Bowler. Like, whether you think he's a Hall of Famer or not, whatever. But come on. Like, you don't have a single quarterback on the round of 25? And in upcoming years, it's probably not going to get any better. Like, Tom Brady and Drew Brees will be first ballot guys, and they absolutely should be. But Big Ben should not be. He can wait a couple of years. He was not on that level. Phillip Rivers and Eli Manning, for all I'm concerned, they can wait outside for a long time, if not forever. But I'm worried, like when an Eli comes up, he might be a first ballot finalist and might only take another year or two to get in, which is freaking ridiculous. You look at his resume, it does not scream Hall of Fame by any stretch of the imagination. I'm resigned to the fact that he's going to get in someday, but they've got to do better with this. These voters need to rethink how they do some of these positions. They need to be able to evaluate players better, in my opinion. Like Vince Wilfork made the semifinals. Cool. Somebody from those Patriots teams of the 2000s needs to be there. I'm okay with that. You got Rodney Harrison too, so okay, that's fine. I can live with that. But where's Kevin Williams? Kevin Williams didn't have the big sack numbers. He had Jared Allen's crappy haircut getting all the media attention. But anybody that watched the Vikings back in the day, that had to face that Williams wall on defense, knows that you feared Kevin Williams, not Jared Allen. Kevin Williams was the dude, but since Kevin Williams played inside and doesn't have the sack numbers of some other guys at other positions, he doesn't advance through the 25. Again, the voters have got to do better with guys like this. If you can only evaluate these players based off of certain statistics, which again, I come back to a guy like Tim McDonald and say they can't even do that right. I come to a guy like Fred Taylor and say, how come he is a semifinalist again, yet it was guys like Shaun Alexander and Jamal Lewis that were all decade running backs for the 2000s. They can't advance, so now the media is contradicting themselves. It makes no sense. Are you only putting in Fred Taylor because of his rank on the career rushing list? Like, they've got to do better. Because again, this stuff matters. You have limited slots a year, and having more slots available doesn't solve anything, because all that means is more bad process allows more of the wrong type of guys to get in the wrong order. The voters have got to do better. I challenge them to do better. I don't have much confidence that they will, because based off of their recent results, I don't think it's going to get better in a lot of ways. I think it's only going to get worse.